Thank you for joining us today for the Price Talks, Policy in a Pandemic series. I'm Erroll, Director of the Safe Communities Institute and Professor of the Practice in National and Homeland Security. My teaching and research focuses on homegrown violent extremism and counterterrorism. I'd like to open by thanking Harley Ham and the Price Office of Development and External Relations for hosting this forum, and Dean Jack Knott for his leadership and support during his 15-year tenure, moving our school to become ranked third in the nation, particularly as he departs for his new position as Dean at NYU. Today, I'm going to talk about the virus of hate and extremist violence incidents that are leveraging COVID-19 while we respond to this global pandemic. There will be slides of this talk available when the video is posted on the Price in the Pandemic site. I always begin my talks by thanking our first responders. Many of our students in our courses at the Safe Communities Institute are fire personnel, police, public health, and others in that sector that are working very, very hard now to address this global pandemic and keep us out of harm's way, and I want to thank them for their service and their courage. At the Safe Communities Institute, just very briefly, we're trying to reach a new understanding of public safety that hinges on education, awareness, and research, and most importantly, community engagement. We're trying to advance violence prevention strategies and policies and research, but mostly we want to contribute to the global security in a time of increasing threats like the one we're facing now. So let's talk about HVE, or homegrown violent extremists. When I wrote the book for the course that I also teach of the same name, Homegrown Violent Extremism describes basically a terrorist act within the context of ideologically motivated violence or plots that are perpetrated within the United States or abroad by American citizens. Now, keep in mind, homegrown violent extremism is not unique to the United States. In fact, I teach at the University of Paris, where they have an incredibly challenging issue with the same kind of violence. And I've also been teaching in Israel for 14 years at the Interdisciplinary Center there, as we talk about Homeland Security and counterterrorism and the issue that they have with people who are, in fact, homegrown. Over the last several years, we've hosted 2 summits on this very topic. In 2017, we had the USC Global Solutions in the Age of Homegrown Violent Extremism Summit, where many of my colleagues who belong to an organization called Life After Hate were present, former extremists from jihadists to neo-Nazis. And then last year, we went digital and hosted the 2019 USC Homegrown Violent Extremism Digital Summit, and all of those summits, by the way, are available on our site. So let's talk about the 3 areas that this HVE dilemma really is being perpetrated by. It is focused on race, religion, or issue-oriented extremist motivations. We've seen now, of course, an increase in incidents involving Asian Americans as victims. There's been increasing anti-Semitism that's been taking place in the last several weeks. And most recently, particularly last weekend, we now have an anti-government effort for those elements that are pushing back against the stay-at-home orders. I hate to say it this way, but it's essentially a trifecta of homegrown violent extremism in those 3 areas: race, religion, and issue orientation. One of the problems we have is many of you are faced with facts, and many of you are faced with misinformation or fake news. So I'm going to start with this premise. The theory and the motto we use at the Safe Communities Institute is really pushed by a famous data scientist named W. Edwards Deming. And he always said, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So we're going to talk about some data. Underlying and fueling this entire issue is the notion that the United States is projected to be a minority country by 2045, which is quite interesting because just about 6 or 7 years ago, the projection was 2050. But now it's 2045. So we have a largely growing anti-immigrant faction that's now leveraging other extremist ideologies to push their agenda. Let's talk about some warnings. And as many of you may know, I'm a former FBI agent. I was assigned to foreign counterintelligence and terrorism. We've had some interesting warnings come out last month from the Bureau. The New York field office said that white supremacists and neo-Nazis were encouraging their members to spread coronavirus to law enforcement and Jewish communities. Last month, we also had a 36-year-old, again, HVE trifecta. He was a racial, religious, and anti-government extremist who plotted to bomb a Kansas City medical center where COVID-19 victims were being treated. And last but not least, the Bureau had an analysis that predicted and warned of an increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans. Last month in Louisville, Kentucky, there was a liquor store there that on their marquee, they had "Thanks China." And I bring that up because words matter during this coronavirus outbreak. They also had posted on that same sign the numbers 14 and 88. For those of you who don't know, the 14 words is a motto, usually perpetrated by white supremacists and white nationalists. And that motto goes something like this: we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. And underneath, in big letters, "Thanks China." Let's talk about the racial component right now. The Asia Pacific Policy and Planning Council has been establishing a site. They started on March 19th. It's an online reporting center. And here's what they found so far. In reports of verbal harassment, shunning, and physical assault, their first week online, they had 670 complaints. By the second week online, they had more than 1,100 complaints. They're averaging 100 complaints a day. What's really disturbing about that is 32% of those complaints that came in were incidents that occurred in California. And I want you all to know where they're happening because we're all staying at home now. But where they are occurring are grocery stores, pharmacies, and big box retail stores. As we talk about religion now, we saw a huge increase in anti-Semitic incidents that occurred after the Charlottesville incident in 2017. In fact, we had 85 total incidents of anti-Semitism that were recorded by the ADL up to August of 2017. And in the following months, we saw a 182% increase. This is largely being perpetrated by people we call accelerationists. These are extremists who've decided that because of the immigration issue, they're going to accelerate their offensive actions to slow the flow, to keep people out of this country, and to make the ones that are here feel unwelcome. The ADL has a survey that just came out this week that says 25% of their respondents have stated that they have done at least one thing to avoid anti-Semitism. 12% are avoiding wearing markers of Judaism, Star of David. 50% fear being attacked in public by wearing Jewish religious symbols or even a violent attack on their synagogue. And what's really sad is 63% of the American Jewish community believe they're less safe today than they were a decade ago. The American Jewish community also put out a report this week that says 20% of the Jews in this country have experienced verbal anti-Semitism, so we can see it's increasing. We know as people who, and I'll speak about USC, we successfully moved 7,000 classes online on Zoom in less than a couple of weeks, but we have been the victim, like some other universities, of Zoom bombing, where we've had self-described white nationalist hacktivists come into our classroom and spout incredibly racial and anti-religious and mostly anti-Semitic things when we're trying to teach classes. And that's been very, very disturbing. And unfortunately, I believe we've got a handle on that. We've seen some interesting online capabilities by these adversaries. And the reason that we're having this discussion is because they are watching how we respond to this pandemic. This is a learning opportunity for them. Back in 2018, you may remember the Tree of Life attacker. He actually used an online platform called Gab. And it was a huge surge in racist and anti-Semitic postings after the 2016 presidential election on that website as well. The next year, in the New Zealand mosque attacker, he used 8chan, which is one of the internet's most notorious hateful online communities. Then unfortunately, last year as well at the Chabad congregation in Poway, that individual posted his white supremacist letter and manifesto sharing on a leverage called Pastebin or a site called Pastebin the morning of the attack. Last but not least, we have our issue-oriented categories, and we have those individuals who are what I call anti-government, anti-immigrant, anti-gay, you name it. And they are now pushing into this arena against the stay-at-home orders in several states. We can't get away from the politics of this matter. I'll just share with you the fact that these anti-government organizations and movements and recruitment actually ebb and flow with Democratic and Republican administrations. During the Clinton administration, we saw an interesting high. Then when George W. Bush became president, we saw a low, in fact, the lowest number of activities we've seen in more than 20 years. There was a huge spike when President Obama became president. I often call it the Obama factor, where we saw an increase of over 700% in terms of their memberships. But what's really disturbing now in the Trump era is that this activity, memberships and incidents, is not waning as it did during other Republican administrations. They are actually picking up steam and gaining momentum. The stay-at-home protests are particularly disturbing as it relates to those states that have open carry laws. California is not an open carry state, as you may know, thanks to the Black Panther Party, who in the 1960s, 1967 to be exact, the Mulford Act was passed in California, which prohibited the carrying of particularly shoulder weapons and open carry in the state of California. So we don't have that issue, but many other states do. We've seen an interesting display of weapons and armament and people protesting under the guise of stay at home during the last several weeks. So let me give you some things that you can do and some things that you can look at. First of all, I want to share the Anti-Defamation League's heat map, HEAT, and the acronym stands for Hate, Extremism, Anti-Semitism, and Terrorism. That's an interactive and customizable map that you can look at every day, developed by the ADL Center on Extremism. It details extremist and anti-Semitic incidents across the nation. I urge you to go to that site. If you'd like a broader picture, you can go to the Southern Poverty Law Center's Hate Watch site, which does the same thing on a more global perspective, looking at anti-Semitic, looking at hate, extremism, terrorism around the world. And again, it's an interactive site that will give you a broader picture. Every morning I get an email from something called the Secure Community Network, SCN. That is something that you can log on to. It'll give you a picture of anti-Semitic incidents that are occurring in the United States or domestically, and also anti-Semitic incidents that are occurring around the world, internationally. And then I'd also like to share with you, we work very closely with the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the Museum of Tolerance here in West LA. They have an app called Combat Hate, all one word. It's resources for you to interpret symbols and language of hate. And there's a lexicon of hate and digital terrorism and a hate CD that's also available if you'd like to learn more. What are we doing online to stop some of this online challenges? As I mentioned, I'm on the board for Life After Hate, an organization largely founded by white supremacists, white nationalists. We deal with all kinds of extremist ideologies, but the ADL, Moonshot, CVE, which stands for Countering Violent Extremism, and Gen Next Foundation is a partnership that online is pushing back against people who try to search for certain extremist ideologies. For example, if you go on and say, I want to join the KKK, Redirect will take you to an Anti-Defamation League project to ask, why do you want to join the KKK? What kinds of things interest you there? And hopefully spin them down into looking at videos of why that might not be a good idea, and hopefully deterring them from going further on to join extremist organizations or partner with others online to talk about that. Last year, we had over 330,000 unique users on our redirect method. So we know people are going there, and hopefully it's having an effect. I'm just going to close with this. You know, one of the things we learn is that all threats and threateners are not equal, but most threateners are unlikely to carry out their threat. However, all threats must be taken seriously. So let me say to all of you, notify the proper authorities. One of the challenges we have is the underreporting of these incidents that are happening. It's very, very important that we know. We're in the process now of working with several organizations across USC under our tagline of #VirusOfHate. And under that, we're working with them to possibly put together an interactive map of where things are happening on our campus, where things are happening in Los Angeles, and hopefully we'll broaden this to a conversation of where things are happening in the county of Los Angeles. Our Virus of Hate link will give you a current listing of news reports, government announcements, and other resources covering extremist activities during the pandemic, and it's regularly updated. And I urge you to go to sci.usc.edu. The last thing I want to say to you is this. You know, this is a very difficult challenge. We've got the pandemic, we've got people trying to stay safe, we've got our first responders in harm's way working to keep us safe during this challenging time. So let me just close with this in the famous words of Winston Churchill. This is not the end. It's not the beginning of the end, but it certainly is the end of the beginning. We need your help. Education and awareness will get us through this. And I say to all of you, fight the virus of hate. And I'll take your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Erroll. And I'm going to be running the questions. So if anybody else has any, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box. So I'm going to start with them right now. How do you feel about the pandemic and the progress people are doing to recover?
I have to say that this has been an incredibly impressive leadership moment. I'm going to be a little self-serving here, say particularly in California, although I do watch Governor Cuomo's briefings every day. Because we responded early, I think we've been able to flatten the curve. I think people have been very responsible. Everywhere I go, there's social distancing has certainly been practiced. People are wearing masks. And this comes at great, great adverse cascading effects as we talk about our economy. People are losing jobs. No one is being able to go anywhere. It's really challenging, but people understand the importance of what they're doing. And I think the response, at least on the local and state level, has been tremendous. And I commend our leaders for being on every single day, letting us know what they're doing, giving us projections, and paying attention to data and science to guide their direction.
The next question is, it is quite disturbing that politicians and members of the administration express sympathy and support for armed protesters, especially since many are white supremacists and are members of right-wing militias. To what extent does this cause law enforcement to be restrained or intimidated in terms of taking action against these protesters if and when they break the law?
This is a very interesting and very good question. As I mentioned previously, we're very fortunate in California to have the Mulford Act, so we don't have an open carry issue. This is very dangerous. As you may recall, back during the Charlottesville incident in 2017, there was an individual who was part of that movement who actually discharged a firearm and fortunately didn't hit or kill anyone. Law enforcement in those states has to abide by that law. However, I do want you to know, as happened last year in Virginia, governors in those states can, in fact, cease and desist orders if they choose to do that. It's a very bold and very courageous move, but they can put restrictions on these protests in terms of where they can be and how often or how long they can be out there. They can establish some guidelines. I would hope that that would happen going forward, but it's going to be a very challenging dilemma as people under this guise of the Second Amendment feel that they can go out dressed as if they're going to war with war weapons to protest staying at home.
Okay. The next question is, what do you believe the impact will be of the most recent immigration ban issued by the executive branch? Will this empower HVE and put others at higher risk? What can we do to combat HVE?
Very good question. At the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that we're going to be a majority-minority nation by 2045. Here again, an immigration ban is a dog whistle to those organizations that are anti-immigrant and don't want to see that happen. We are all staying at home globally. So to push out an anti-immigration notion now, or legislation or executive order now, to me seems really counterproductive to what we're doing. It fuels the fire of those people who are being victimized, particularly Asian Americans, that this pandemic started overseas. It fuels the fire that we've seen in the last several years as it relates to immigrants, our DACA students and people like that. So it doesn't help our situation. I think to your question, it adds fire to the fuel of homegrown violent extremists, and they're certainly going to leverage this moment to push this agenda forward. I won't even describe or repeat some of the incidents that I heard on a call yesterday that have happened to our Asian American students in the last several weeks. It's disgusting, and unfortunately, with moves like this at the executive level, it's going to get worse.
And that leads into the next question a little bit, but are there resources you shared translatable to address the virus of hate for Asian Americans?
I think they are. We're trying to track hate and extremist violence. So while we have a number of resources that are devoted to anti-Semitism, as I mentioned previously, we have several Asian American organizations, and we're working with the USC Pacific Asian Museum to put those resources out there for Asian Americans as well. Hate has no boundaries, and the extremist violence and hate that's associated with COVID-19 has no boundaries, and it is affecting people of all races, all colors and nationalities and religions. And we want to know what's happening, and they are translatable to other ethnicities.
The next question is, a concern that with so many kids, especially teens, are now doing online school, they're more vulnerable to recruitment to these hate movements. What can be done?
They absolutely are more vulnerable, which is why I wanted to share our redirect method that's out there being put out by the ADL and Moonshot CVE, as well as NextGen. I would urge you to visit the Life After Hate site, where I'm on their board. We do address that. We are very, very aware of the fact that the online community is very active. And for you parents that may be watching this, I caution you that when you're not just homeschooling, be very, very aware of the games that your children are playing. Gaming has become an incredible recruitment tool for violent extremists. And if you want more information on that, our friends at Life After Hate, particularly my friends who have been in the white supremacist and neo-Nazi movements, they can talk to you about how dangerous gaming is and how it lures people into that world unbeknownst to them. And before you know it, they're speaking the language. And then, unfortunately, they may decide to walk the walk.
The next question is, given the challenge of the pandemic, how do you suggest we report hate where call lines, et cetera, are stressed?
So what we have to do now, again, is use some of the sites that I mentioned. The Combat Hate site out of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. There are obviously call lines into all law enforcement agencies for non-emergency calls. These are not 911 calls, and I urge you not to call 911 because those systems can be overwhelmed. Unfortunately now, the 911 systems are people that are responding usually to medical emergencies. I can tell you that my public safety graduate students are working shifts of 12 hours on and 12 hours off, and they've told me how challenging it is. So do call the non-emergency lines to report that information. If you're a student, report it to your police department or Department of Public Safety. If it's USC, let us know. We'll make sure it gets to the proper authorities, and we'll make sure that people know it's happening, where it's happening, and try to mitigate that from happening again.
Okay, the next question is, what can we do to help the Asian American and Jewish communities during this time?
I think what you can do is what you're doing right now. Make yourself better educated and aware that this is happening. Share this information. What's really troubling for me is when we go out and give talks on this subject, the number of people, not just you, but even public safety, police and fire personnel who are unaware that this is happening. At the Safe Communities Institute for the last 6 to 8 months, we have been overwhelmed with requests from the faith-based community giving talks on homegrown violent extremism and protecting houses of worship. Over the last year and a half, we've seen attacks on synagogues, mosques, churches by extremist violent people, and they're very concerned about, do I need a guard? Does the guard need to be armed? Should we have a badging system? What kind of security do we need? So what you can do is what you're doing now. Educate yourself, make yourself more aware, look at the sites that I mentioned to show you where and when this is happening because they're updated every day, and just basically stay informed and share what you're learning. The best weapon for this issue is education.
The next question is, what implications of COVID-19 do you see for recruitment? Have you seen an increase in recruitment?
It's hard to say. It's difficult to put numbers on this. We can say that we've seen an online effort by extremist organizations to suggest they should be leveraging this moment. The information I shared earlier from the FBI, their analysis shows that this is actually happening. They, as I mentioned previously, actually going out and telling people if you're infected to try to infect Asian Americans and the Jewish community. I think that we're going to see an increase in that, but again, it's very difficult to put numbers on this, and we're very careful in sharing numbers of violent extremists because we don't want to give them any credit for growing larger than they already are. They would have you believe they're a majority of the population, but they're not. They're a very small percentage, and we want to contain them as much as we possibly can.
And how organized are these hate groups? Are they ad hoc groups, or could they organize themselves into a more sustained action?
Some of them are very organized. What we've seen over the years is that they've taken on a very decentralized organizational structure, sort of like a cell structure that we've seen in terrorist organizations around the world, staying autonomous, staying offline. They understand that law enforcement has many of them on their radar. So they're doing everything they can to avoid being detected, to avoid being tracked and investigated. So they are semi-organized. They have their own, what we call safe spaces of hate that they operate in. They've been vetting each other in some of those instances when they've been trying to meet up before we had COVID-19 stay-at-home orders. So they're very sophisticated and they understand how we operate. Many of them operate in the dark web using Tor or other platforms like that. So they're doing everything they can to evade detection and investigation by the appropriate law enforcement agencies.
So the last question we'll get to is, in light of the restrictions against mass gatherings, many houses of worship will likely open as numerous microsites rather than large traditional services. Do you think this will make worshipers more susceptible or less susceptible to the threat of violence, especially in culturally diverse
That's a very good question. I think, first of all, the most important thing about houses of worship opening up is how they're going to maintain some kind of social distancing so we don't have people get infected because they're actually trying to worship. That's one issue. I do think, again, once people start to recongregate at their appropriate houses of worship, they do stand the risk of attack, but probably no more so than they did before we actually had stay-at-home orders. So they'll be exercising the same kind of safety and security measures that they had in place before, and they'll be vigilant. I do have to say this about the faith-based community. They've been very receptive to law enforcement, Department of Homeland Security, and other entities helping them with safety and security for their respective locations. And we hope that they'll be continuing to do that after this is over.
Okay, great. We have time for one more last question. And I just want to also mention this video is actually being streamed on Facebook Live and will be available for viewing immediately following this session. The last question is, why do you believe the president stopped the progress for illegals to get green cards?
I think that the newest anti-immigration push is, again, fuel for that fire that I mentioned at the opening of this talk about this country becoming a majority-minority nation. It is a dog whistle to violent extremist organizations. It is a push to not have people of color here, people from other countries here. There's no other reason at this point in time we're dealing with a global pandemic when the entire globe is basically staying at home to push forward an anti-immigration executive order. So that's being read by the certain members of his base that want to stop the flow of people into this country as a wink and a nod that it will continue to go on. And here, as we are trying to address a health issue, we're pushing forward a political issue, and this is not the time nor place to do that.
Thank you so much, Erroll. We really appreciated today's session, and thank you all for joining us. I hope that you'll join us next week for our continued virtual series, Policy in a Pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you.